to WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul, and this is the Adam Messer Show. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and I'm excited to announce that we have a special guest on today. You've heard him before. He was on not too long ago, named Michael Sorensen, and we talked about his book last time called I Hear You, which is a great book about emotional intelligence and empathetic listening. A lot of really good skills in that book and tips on how to improve relationships and building relationships. And Michael, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Adam. Excited to be here.
I'm really excited about having you back on. We're going to be talking today about your new podcast. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So like we talked last time about my book is titled I Hear You, and teaches all about validation, emotional validation, and how powerful it is in strengthening relationships, any relationships, right? Romantic, professional, or otherwise. And in it's been a little over 2 years now since publication. I'm receiving more and more reader emails and more questions that I make an effort to respond to online on my blog. But I find that a lot of people like a podcast. A lot of people like to listen. I mean, imagine if you're listening to this show right now, you're one of those people. And so I ultimately felt like a podcast would be a great avenue to do some continued teaching, some continued education. So I dive in a little deeper in the podcast, which is still quite new, into validation, but also other principles that I didn't cover in the book, such as personal responsibility, codependency, boundaries, and all of the other tools that I learned through therapy and research to help people build stronger, happier relationships.
I'll tell you what, I've used that validation a lot. And, one of the major topics that we talked about last time was like with people venting. A lot of times when people are venting, they don't want you to give them an answer necessarily. They just want to be heard. And that has been such an invaluable tool for me. I've used that probably every day since I've read your book. I mean, the validation, where it's like, I hear you. I really get what you're saying. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, like you said, but it just means that, like they're being heard. Michael, one of the things that I do on my show is that my son, Sebastian, he has a band called Krieger. It's like a death metal, thrash metal band, and he always plays live for me. So I'm going to have him play a little bit for us, and then we're going to dive back into the conversation, okay?
Sounds great.
All right. Everybody, this is Sebastian Messer, and his band is called Krieger. Take it away, son. That was my son, Michael. He's been playing for almost 4 years now, and he's 17. So it's like, that's pretty cool. So,
nice.
Yeah. I do want to also, everybody that's listening, I just want to pay tribute to one of our friends here, one of our hosts, Sandy Batiste. She passed away this week, and so, we just want to, say our condolences. We did a moment of silence in the last hour. And I just wanted to, Sandy was always such a nice person, very friendly. Michael, she had a show called One Human Nation, and it was a lot about relationship building, and and how different people. She talked about race relations, and she talked about how can we get along better as people. And so she actually passed away this last week, and they had the funeral yesterday, and so I just wanted to just do a shout out for Sandy because she was such a wonderful person. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, yeah. It was just kind of a shock for all of us, and but for our listeners at home, I just wanted to share that with you. We miss Sandy, and so. But you know what? One of the things I loved about your book, I Hear You, was talking about empathetic listening and how we all can use that skill set. So can you tell
Yeah,
us a little bit more about that? And I know you, with the podcast, I'm sure you're probably diving into these topics with the podcast too.
yeah. I mean, it's still, we're on our eighth episode now, but we'll absolutely dive in the future episode into empathy, into listening skills and techniques. So, I mean, Adam, like you said, empathic or empathetic listening is crucial, and it's less and less. It's a skill that fewer and fewer of us have nowadays because of our. Well, I think it's largely because of technology and our phones and all the apps.
Yeah.
I love technology. Don't get me wrong. I'm every bit as addicted to my smartphone as the next person. But I argue in my book that people don't want just to know that we hear the words that they've said,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's in my book, I refer to that as listening, right? You may understand the words that they're saying, but when you're in a conversation with somebody, really what you want is to know that the other person is connecting with the emotions that you're sharing, that they're actually connecting with what the meaning is behind the words that you're sharing. And so that's what's known as empathic listening, which is using
Oh, okay. So it's
empathy to
empathic. I
understand.
always thought it was empathetic. I'm sorry.
Oh, I think it's both. Frankly, I think that it's two different ways of saying it. So, but it's the same concept. It's listening to the emotion that the other person is expressing, because
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
critical to validation, right? Not just saying, "Oh, that's cool," but
yeah.
going, "No way," right? That's awesome. That's so get excited with them.
I remember one
Or
of the examples that you gave was like talking about something that you were so excited about, and I can't remember if it was a girlfriend or your brother or somebody, and they were just like, "Oh yeah," and you were like, all the just get the wind knocked out of you because you're like, man, you're
right,
so geared up about it, and then the other person's like, "Oh, that's nice."
yeah, that's cool.
You're like, "What?
Yeah,
I just
exactly.
did this epic thing," and you're like, "Oh, whatever."
Right, right. Well, and the funny thing in that instance, so for you listeners who may not have read the book or heard the story, I won't relate the whole story here, but you might listen to that response and go, "Oh, that's cool," and think, "Okay, well, she's not that interested," and she's purposely
Hmm.
acting not interested. But in this instance, it was a girl that I was dating at the time, and she was interested, and she was, I guess, she claims to have been excited for me, but her personality was quite. How do I say this? She didn't have a lot of dynamic
Hmm.
in all of that, and so it was just funny because clearly the disappointment was evident on my face because she said cool, and I just kind of looked at her, and then she said what, like what
Yeah,
more do you want from me?
yeah,
And I remember thinking in that moment, well, what was it that I wanted from her? Because she did listen, and she knew what had happened. But what I realized later is what I was wanting was that validation. I was wanting
right.
more than just cool. I was wanting to feel heard and appreciated, understood. I wanted to know that she was sharing in that excitement with me.
Yeah.
And that was one of those early experiences that I had that ultimately led me to write the book, because I realized that all of us humans, at some point or another, are craving that sense of connection, that understanding. And validation is one of the easiest ways to show that.
I think validation for me, since I've read the book, it's one of those terms that you don't think about, but we all know what it is. We all
Right.
know, like it's like when someone else they get what you're saying. They don't just hear the words like you said, but they get what you're saying, and they actually feel, for you like, oh yeah, that is great. Even though they might not understand, what you're talking about in that any depth or whatever, but they show like that, excitement for you or whatever. Or it could be something, if you're having a bad experience, like we were talking about Sandy passing away. You wouldn't say, "Oh,
Yeah.
that's great." That would be an awkward way to do it. You would, you'd say, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that," or you just can share in that emotion with them, not necessarily having to take on the emotion, but you can feel for that person, that empathy, with them.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the questions that I get from time to time is, well, what if I don't what if I can't relate to what they're sharing? Let's say,
Yeah,
for
that's a
example,
great one.
Adam, like you said, is that if it's something very difficult, let's say it is the death of a family member, perhaps, or something where maybe you can't completely relate to them. One of the first things I recommend doing, I mean, for one, you can just look again for that emotion. And so if they're
Hmm.
coming to you and they're sharing something and they're somber and they're having a tough time, matching that energy is the first step, right? Even if you don't even know what's going on. And I think most of us do that um, inherently. Most of us, again, if someone's coming to you and they're crying, you're not going to go, "Oh man, I'm so sorry. That's too bad." Most of us are good at matching their emotion that they're feeling.
Hmm.
But then if you're struggling to latch onto something to validate, then you can ask one or two follow-up questions or exploratory questions. So you might say in that instance, "Oh my gosh, how are you feeling?"
Hmm.
And that's pretty basic. And most people will just say, "I don't know," right, or something like that. If you want to take it a little step further, you could almost, I call it kind of a guessing game, but you could throw out a few emotions that you think they're feeling. Like, geez, I can't even, I mean, you must just feel like you got the wind knocked out of you, right? Adam, you said that earlier. Or you might just feel something.
Right.
And you respectfully put an emotion out there, and then they either say, "Yeah, that's exactly how I'm feeling," or they say, "No, I'm not really feeling that. I think I'm just feeling hurt, or I'm
Mm.
feeling embarrassed, or I'm feeling scared."
Well,
But then
sometimes
that
people don't
gives
want
you
to
some
share their
emotion.
feelings either, right? I mean, sometimes
Exactly,
people
exactly.
they have a hard time saying, I'm embarrassed, or I'm ashamed, or I'm afraid, or whatever. They have a hard time saying it.
Right, right.
What about
Absolutely.
what about the times where you have someone who has good intentions but they accidentally invalidate someone? And I'll give you an example. So like if someone's having a bad day, like say they have depression or something like that, and the other person's like, "Oh, just put on a happy face and just get up and do this or whatever." And the other person has good intentions, but they're completely invalidating the person
Hmm.
that is feeling that way. What do you think about that? What's a good way to for someone who has good intentions but they might not really understand that situation?
Sure. Yeah, I love that you asked that question. And for those listeners who may not quite be familiar with the term invalidation, it's exactly what Adam said there, where basically what you do inadvertently is you shoot down what the other person is feeling. So if they say, "Well, I'm feeling really depressed right now," or "I'm feeling sad or angry or upset," and we say, "Oh, don't be," or "It's going to be okay," or
Yeah,
"He didn't
yeah.
mean to hurt you," or whatever it is. If it's something that shoots down how they're feeling, then it's invalidating. And maybe we talk later today on the interview about why that's a problem. But Adam, getting back to your question in that situation, there's two ways we could approach it. Let's say first you are the third person in that exchange, right? So maybe there's two of you, and one person has shared something difficult, and the person next to you invalidates them, and they say, "Oh, you know what? Just put a smile on your face, just tough it out," and you go, "Oh, that's
Yeah.
not very validating." Then what I like to do is you just step in and you offer the validation. And so I might just look at that person and just say, "I'm sorry, like that is it's really tough," and that's validating, right? That's a validating statement. And so right in there in those instances, you can you can offer that validation. That person will likely latch onto it. I actually remember an instance of there was a teenager that wrote in who read my book,
Hmm.
and he shared something similar to what you just posed there, Adam, where he was with a group of young men his age. He didn't know most of them actually, but they were talking about religion of all things, which I'm sure you can imagine can get quite heated,
Hmm.
because there was one young man who he was expressing some doubt in what the other men believed in, and he's like, I don't know," and these other guys were trying to convince him basically and said, "No, come on, man, like you shouldn't worry about that. Like that's not that big of a deal." Like so on and so forth. And this other teenager, the one who wrote into me, said that he was watching this conversation and he could see that one young man getting more and more closed off because he didn't feel like these other guys were listening to him. He didn't feel like they were respecting him for his own beliefs, his own opinions. And so this other kid said that he realized, oh, he just wants validation. These other guys are just shooting him down. And so he came in and he said, "Hey man, I totally get why you're doubting that, or it makes total sense to me why you're nervous about this." And he
Yeah.
said the kid turned to him and was like, "Yeah, thank you," and they were able to talk. And the kid who was validating him was able to really build a strong connection. And he said for the rest of that week, it was like a summer camp type thing.
Mm-hmm.
He said for the rest of that week, we became great friends.
Wow.
Like we still, kind of had different beliefs, but he said just because I was able to validate him, just because I was able to show him that I respected where he was coming from, it made a night and day difference.
Wow.
In the connection that we had.
Was that a kid that wrote in? Was that a person that had read the book?
Yes.
Wow.
He read the book.
Wow. That's amazing how the person was able to take, what they read and understood and use it in a situation like that. Because, teenage years, there's a lot of angst and there's a lot of miscommunication and things like that. And, there's a lot of emotions and hormones and, a lot of things like that. So, that's, I think that's an awesome example of how, those skill sets come into play. And, y'all are listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and this is the Adam Messer Show. And my special guest today is Michael Sorensen. He's written I Hear You, and you have a new podcast. Michael, what is your podcast called?
It's called the I Hear You podcast.
The I Hear You podcast. I love that. And where can people listen to the I Hear You podcast?
It should be available in your podcast app of choice. So Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn.
All the places, right?
Yeah. If you don't use any of those podcast platforms, they're also available for streaming on my website. That's michaelsorensen.com. And you can find the episodes on there.
That's really cool. I've noticed with your Instagram thing that you post like little snippets too, the little video snippets. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
So
kind of a fun way to give insight.
What are some of the? You said you're on episode 8. What are some of the topics that you've talked about so far?
Sure. So right now, kind of in the first 10 or so episodes, I'm working on what I consider foundational concepts of emotional intelligence. Some of the most important concepts that really we all need to understand if we just want to live happier lives. Mm-hmm. So I focus the podcast primarily on relationships, but again, not just romantic. I give examples of business settings, of issues with family, and then of course issues with your romantic partner. Or I shouldn't say issues, but opportunities to improve your relationships with these people. And so some of the core concepts that we've talked about thus far are taking responsibility for your own happiness. That's a big one that I'm a big proponent of. We could dive into some of these if you want, Adam, or we could talk about other things. But personal responsibilly.
Let's talk about the happiness one, because I think that's a huge one. We are. I really agree with that. We are responsible for our own happiness, and like Tony Robbins talks about, when you make progress, you can be happy, and that when we have expectations. It's a lot of times it's because what we have an expectation of, our reality is not meeting that expectation, which causes, this discord. And, so I'd like to hear your spin on that and what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And that's something that, depending on where you are in your life and what's happening in your life, you might agree with readily, or you might say that's bullcrap. I don't believe that, because I grew up in an abusive family, or have an abusive spouse, or what have you. But I'm a big proponent of, if you are an adult, you are capable of making decisions to get yourself out of bad situations. So, because I mentioned abuse, I want to just quickly touch on that I tread lightly with that and cautiously, because I am not at all suggesting that victims of abuse are not victims, because they absolutely are, and it's important that those people find help, right? Especially children. But even if you are an adult in an abusive relationship, I strongly recommend you seek help. With that said, oftentimes people will pretend that they're a victim, or they'll feel like they're a victim when they're really not. So they might they might complain about their job. Oh my gosh, I hate my boss. He always does this. They might complain about their spouse. Oh, she just never will, follow through on her commitments, or my husband just never helps with the laundry. Whatever it is, we oftentimes fall into this trap of feeling like the victim in our life. But the reality is, we have the power to change that. we can choose to talk to people. We can choose to leave our job. We can choose to make changes in our life that will bring that happiness we're looking for. And so that was my second episode on the podcast, because it is a foundational element for everything else we talk about. That if we're sitting in that victim mindset of, oh, woe is me, I live a hard life, we're not going to live a very happy life. But it's possible to turn that around.
I think that goes kind of back to that old saying, "Misery loves company." And you know, I've known people that they're not happy unless they're miserable. And I grew up around people like that, and you know, I avoid people like that. You know, I think we talked about like emotional vampires the last time, and you know, there is a huge cultural thing going on where it's kind of like victim culture, and I think it's like an attention thing, or it's kind of like, you know, and I agree with you about the abusive relationship, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, those folks, you know, you're an advocate for therapy. You talked about, you know, going to therapy, you know, get help, seek help. There's, you know, stuff out there.
Absolutely.
But I do agree with ownership, you know, and being accountable to yourself and trying to live, you know, that best life that you can. You know, and I think it kind of goes back to those expectations again, because, you know, like honestly, you have a best-selling book, you know, you've got a best-selling audiobook. And, you know, there are folks out there that are like, man, I wish I was in your seat. I wish I was doing this, you know, and they don't see, they see the end result. They don't see the work that goes into it. Right. And then they're also, you know, not necessarily happy about the progress that they have. So, you know, they're not really appreciating, you know, the level that they're at. All they see is like, you know, that, I guess, that envy or that jealousy or whatever. And I'm like, you know what, that's it, you know, your success is not impeding on my success, you know?
Right.
And I mean, like I like to celebrate other people's success. You know what I mean? It's the pie is not infinite. I mean, I'm not sorry. I was trying to say finite. It's infinite, you know. There's not like just this little tiny bit out there, and I think a lot of people end up comparing themselves to others, and they're like, well, you know, they have this and they have that, and I wish I had that. If I only had this, or if I only had that, you know, you get a lot of folks that they're, you know, they don't appreciate where they're at or what they're doing, and they don't take ownership of the decisions that they've made to, you know, that landed them in that spot. You know, it's like, well, if you're not happy with your diet, or if you're not happy with being overweight, well, okay, where are you at now? What are the decisions that you made every day to get there? You know, what are the decisions you can make to get out of that? You know,
exactly.
And I love, one of the things I love is the leadership and self-development stuff. Actually, that's how I came across your book, you know, because I'm always listening to audiobooks, and, you know, I think that self-ownership and that commitment to, you know, to yourself, you know, is a big part of happiness. You know, I really love that you tackled that topic.
It absolutely is. Well, and I like that you know, as you're talking about ownership, that you mentioned food, because literally 15 minutes before this interview, Adam, I was talking to my wife, and, you know, the past couple of weeks we've been talking about how we want to get into better shape, you know, and I find myself thinking often, oh, I just feel horrible, you know, because I ate a bunch of junk food the night before and all these things, and I have to keep myself accountable and go, well, okay, like, you don't get to complain, like, and I have to catch myself, you know, to not complain to my wife when I eat poorly, because it doesn't help me to do that, and it certainly doesn't help her. And so, you know, something as simple, quote unquote, as that is just saying, you know what, Michael, if you're going to choose to eat junk food, you don't get to complain to everybody around you about how you don't feel well. And so at any point I can change.
Well, that decision is not just about what you're putting in your mouth. You know, it's also like when you're, you know, going to the grocery store, or when you're going out to eat, you know,
exactly.
I mean, we're inundated with commercials, and we're inundated with marketing and advertising, and you know, and it's not just one decision. It's like a bunch of little decisions that lead up to it. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, you know, I want to go out and have, you know, some drinks, and I want to eat, you know, this and that and the other, and we're going to have some fun. And, you know, and like you kind of plan that out, but it's not just one decision saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to eat a bag of Cheetos tonight.
Exactly.
Like, how did the Cheetos get in the house in the first place? Well, you had to buy them, you know?
Exactly.
So it's a series of
Oh,
decisions, I think.
yeah, yeah. And I want to take this into relationships for a moment, Adam,
Yeah,
if you're good with that. Because, then some questions that I do get from readers or from people who listen to my podcast, they say, and I have to be careful here because no disrespect to these individuals. They write in with very real concerns and they say, well, Michael, you make it sound so simple. I can't just choose to be happy. I've been, been married to my spouse for 20 or 30 years and we're just not happy, and we've tried, we've gone to therapy, but he doesn't work on it or she doesn't work on it, whatever the case.
Mm-hmm.
But they say, so how do I choose to be happy? Can you really say that this is still my choice? And my response to them is kind of what you're saying there, Adam, that it's oftentimes baby steps. So I don't mean to minimize the difficulty there by just saying, well, just choose to be happy, because that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
Yeah. What I'm saying is we all have responsibility for our own happiness. And so if I'm in a relationship and I'm not happy with it, well, I need to start figuring out what my expectations are, right, Adam? That's what you said. What is it that I'm expecting my spouse to do that he or she's not? What is it that I'm expecting to feel that I'm not? And maybe you say, well, I just don't feel like we have enough quality time together because of the kids. Now, that's passing blame there for a moment onto the kids, right? Is it really the kids' fault? Are they taking all your time?
Right.
Or have you just not made it enough of a priority to find time? And so there are a billion different ways. Everyone's situation is unique, but it starts with you. It starts with you saying, what is it that I want? And then working with your partner and trying to find out a creative solution together. And if your partner's not willing to work on it with you, then find a therapist, find a friend that you can confide in, and start figuring out what steps you need to take. For some people, it's going to be as simple as having a conversation with a partner who's willing to work with them and they figure it out. For other people, it's going to be much more difficult because maybe your partner refuses to even talk to you. Well, that's when I strongly recommend getting a therapist involved, because you might have some bigger decisions in front of you there.
And, the thing I love about when you're talking about that is this is all just common sense, real world application that you have come through your own personal experiences, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, like you've lived through this. So this is all stuff that, you've dealt with, and you're offering to people. You're just saying, hey, this is what works for me. I can't tell you that it's going to be the end all answer for you, and I couldn't agree more with that, because when we're doing things, as adults, one of the things, I'm going to just share this with you, Michael. I didn't talk about this the last time. I want to share this with you, but I love inspirational stuff, right? And so, one of the things I would try to do would be to come up with these clever little phrases or whatever. I mean, we've seen them all over, Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. But one of the ones that I came up with was, decision has the opportunity to change destiny into destination. And I
love that.
Yeah, I believe that we have the power to make choices. And, to people who, and I'm just talking, I'm just going to share this with people. But when I, as an adult, I decided that I wanted to be the person that I needed as a kid to protect myself. So a lot of people talk about the inner child and all that stuff or whatever. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm just talking about my own personal experience. But I became that person that I wish I'd had when I was a kid to protect me. And I think as adults, we have a lot of burdens. I mean, we have a lot of responsibilities and things like that. But we have that choice every day. Everything that we do, we have a decision that we can make. Even like this conversation, we're talking right now. I could be disengaged. I could be playing on my phone. I could be doing whatever while we're chit-chatting,
Right.
Or I could choose to be in the moment with you and talk with you, while we're having this conversation, and I think that's the same with every interaction that we have. We can choose to be in the moment, being mindful, or we can choose not to be. And sometimes, we're distracted. I mean, I'm not talking about like, when you got somebody that interrupts your thought pattern right then, and, they just come up to you out of nowhere. I'm not talking about that, but I'm just talking about like when you're having a conversation, you have that choice. You know, and I love that you say, you know, you can choose to be happy. It's your responsibility, because it really is. I mean, when we blame other people, you know, are we taking ownership of our own lives? If we don't have ownership of our own lives, how can we ever be the master of our own minds, our own thoughts and
Right.
emotions? You know, so
Right.
I love the fact that you tackle that. That's a very difficult subject.
It is. And here's the other side of that coin, which is fantastically freeing when it really sinks in. So the front side of this coin is you and only you are responsible for your own happiness.
True.
No, it's no one else's job to make you happy.
That's so
The other
true.
side of that coin is that means it's also not your job to make anybody else happy.
That's so
And
true.
that's something that a lot of us struggle with. You know, in the clinical world, it's known as codependency, but this sense feeling of responsibility for other people's happiness, for other people's actions. And that's something that as a society, I know a lot of us struggle with, because oftentimes it's under the guise of being kind or
Hmm.
having compassion or being caring. But what happens, you know, there's nothing wrong with compassion and kindness, but where it slips into codependency and where it becomes unhealthy is when we give up our own happiness, when we give up our own health or our own preferences begrudgingly to help somebody else.
Yeah.
And so that's also where this happiness piece comes in here, where it's perfectly all right to set boundaries and say, you know what, I'm not okay with that. That's
Yeah.
not going to
Yeah.
work for me. I'm going to do this for myself because this is what my soul needs. So it's very freeing, both sides. It's not no one else's responsibility to make you happy. It's also not your responsibility to make anyone else happy.
And you know, I think that is really a neat side of the other coin, like you're talking about, because you're talking about going back to ownership for yourself. You know, it's like, okay, I am ultimately the one who is responsible for my thoughts and my actions and my emotions. You know, I took talking about emotional intelligence. I had to take a 1 credit class, an elective, for my undergrad, and I took this class on emotional intelligence. And the textbook was Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence book, and he talks about the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence in there. And up until that point, and I'm like 30. I was older when I graduated. So I was like, oh gosh, 2008. So 11 years ago, I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
I was like 31, almost 32. I'd never really heard about emotional intelligence. And, you know, this is still like in 2008, Facebook was still relatively new. You know, YouTube and stuff was still relatively new. You know, we have a wealth of information available to us. And there's so many people out there today that, you know, have all these different things that they talk about. And, you know, before that, if you didn't really know about stuff, I mean, I'm just going to say pre-internet, if you didn't know about it, you know, it was a little bit more difficult to kind of accidentally come across it, you know?
Right.
I mean, somebody might be driving in Savannah here and just tune in and they hear us talking, you know?
Right.
But, you know, with that, I had no idea what emotional intelligence was, you know, and it opened up my eyes and my thoughts. And I was like, you know what? I want to learn more about this. And so I started reading about it. That's about the same time. I've always liked to read stuff about management and leadership, but that was about the same time that I started learning more about self-development and, you know, empathy and things like that, you know, and listening.
Right.
You know, like you know, one of the biggest skill sets that I try to work on is my listening, and I know that that's one of my biggest opportunities because, you know, I'm not always the best listener, and I know that, and I'm like, you know, I catch myself sometimes. I'm like, oh, you know, I'm sorry, go ahead, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but I love how you talk about that. What got you into, like, you know, you had the book in the audiobook, which is awesome. And the podcast world, I mean, it seems like the podcast world is blown up. Like, I've had my podcast since I started the radio show, but I recently relaunched the podcast using Libsyn and Apple Podcast. And so what got you interested in doing it? Because it's, you know, that's a whole nother set of, you know, work that you know, things that you have to do with that.
Right. Oh man, I'm not gonna lie, I don't enjoy it. It is a ton of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of
know,
work.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and especially the way that the podcast is currently structured is they're a little, I can't quite call them bite sized, but they're anywhere from 30 to 45-minute lessons. It's a ton of work to prepare it. You're absolutely right. And so, and yet the reason I am reason I'm producing it is the same reason that I wrote the book in the first place. And that's that I felt some kind of this is going to sound cheesy, but a higher calling to do it.
Yeah.
I just felt like I'm so blessed. I have so much value in my life, so much clarity in my life from all these principles. And again, for listeners just joining us, if you don't know much of my background, I learned the principles that I teach in my book and on the podcast through 4 years of therapy. I started seeing a therapist a number of years ago to get help working through an addiction. We're talking about personal responsibility and choices. And I learned so many principles that were just, in my mind, core, key life principles that transformed my life. And so that is why I wrote the book, because I wanted to pay it forward. That is why I'm producing the podcast, because while I put forth a lot of great content in the book, one short book is not enough to teach everything. And so the podcast is an aim to continue to promote that. Not promote that, to spread all of the additional principles as far and wide as I can.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the podcast, one of the reasons why I wanted to do it was because I talk with authors and artists and entertainers, and, like getting to talk to someone like you. This is, I love listening and reading nonfiction, leadership and self-development stuff. So, like I was just talking the last hour, I was talking to a lady named Maggie Duncan, and she writes about spy espionage fiction, and as a kid, I used to read a lot of fiction, but as an adult, I just love self-development. I feel like, we always have an opportunity to be a better version of ourselves. And,
right.
That I think that's one of the biggest opportunities out there is that we, there's no competition with other people. It's ourself. Are we trying to be better than we were yesterday? Or are we trying to be better than, so-and-so was yesterday?
Right. Exactly.
And
that comparison never helps, never serves.
Yeah, I agree. So what are some of the other topics that you've talked about on your show?
Sure. So I mentioned briefly codependency, right? That's one of the more popular ones right now, because it's something so many of us struggle with. The other is boundaries. That's one that will actually be released Tuesday.
Okay.
Now that I think about it, I just finished a wrap production on it yesterday. And boundaries, for those of you who aren't familiar, essentially boundaries are physical or metaphorical lines that help separate what is ours and what is someone else's. So obvious boundaries in the physical world are fences, right? You have a fence up, and that tells you where you have responsibility and where you don't. What part of this land is your yard and what part is your neighbor's. And that's helpful in the physical world, obviously, because then you know what you can spend time on and what you shouldn't worry about. In the emotional world, in the relationship world, boundaries are a little harder to see and a little harder to set, but they're every bit as important. And so it may be something as simple as setting an expectation with your spouse that you would like them to be home every day at 6 p.m. And you two get to work together to decide if that's something you're both willing to commit to. But that's setting forth an expectation that you have, like, again, Adam, you mentioned earlier, and making sure that both parties involved are willing to respect that. It could be something, if you have a sibling come over and spend the night at your house, maybe they want to spend a week at your house, you say, absolutely, you're welcome to do that. But I have a few stipulations, if you will, a few boundaries, right? Maybe they're struggling with alcohol, and you say, you're welcome to stay here, but no drinking, while you're in our house. And doesn't matter what it is, but you just figure out what it is that you need to set in order to make sure that you feel safe and comfortable. A boundary is how you tell the rest of the world what you are and aren't okay with.
Yeah. I think boundaries are important as well. And you also have to set them with yourself sometimes too. You're like, no, like we were talking about doing better with our health choices or whatever. We have to say no. Like, there's times where I'll give you an example, Michael. I quit drinking back in July, and I just felt like I was tired of, drinking alcohol. So I haven't had any since July.
Right.
And, there's times where I want to have a drink, an adult beverage or whatever. And, and I don't feel like I was at the point where, I was so dependent on it or anything like that. I was just tired of drinking. But there's times where, I'm like, man, I'd like to have a cold beer, or I'd like to have a glass of wine or whatever. But I remind myself, okay, well, you quit drinking because you just were tired of it. Do you just want to drink because you want to drink? Or, I have to ask myself those questions like, why do you want a drink? And so, one of the events that I do in town is a fundraiser for the Ronald McDonald Charities. It's called Books and Brews. And it's at a local brewery called Southbound Brewing Company. And so I do this event, and I don't actually drink at my own event. So I'll get a Coke, I'll get like a Diet Coke or something like that.
Nice.
But yeah, they're great. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's having to exercise some self-discipline, and my expectation is, okay, well, I don't want to drink, so I have to set that boundary and say no. This is where I'm at. I don't want to go over that line and say, oh, well, I'm just gonna have a drink or two, and I don't. It's just, I guess, something that you have to work on. It doesn't happen overnight with anything. If you want to write a book, you're not going to write the book in one day. You have to
Right.
you have to spend the time working on it, and
Right.
putting those tools in there and doing the actual work. So,
And those commitments to yourself are huge.
yeah, yeah.
It's oftentimes we are far quicker to break a commitment to ourselves than we are anyone else outside of us, which is interesting, because really what that's saying, if you unpack it, is you're saying that you are as important as everyone else in your life.
Yeah.
You don't value your own opinion of yourself. You don't value your own health. You don't value your own time as much as everybody else's. Which, if you say it out loud, doesn't sound that great, and yet most of us do that. And so I'm a big believer, Adam, like you said, in those personal commitments and in holding to them. Obviously, easier said than done, but we have to, because otherwise, if we teach ourselves that, okay, I'm not going to drink. Well, but that's a great drink. Okay, just this once, boom, there it goes.
Yeah.
And you don't make that progress, and you don't make the changes that you want to have in your life.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's when you're talking earlier about doing something to please someone else at our own sacrifice, we are a lot quicker to commit and follow through with a commitment with other people. It's a lot easier to say, oh yeah, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this show for Adam. I'm gonna be on there Sunday at 3:00 Eastern Standard Time. It's not like it's in the middle of my Sunday at all, right? But if you were to say, well, I'm going to record, my podcast Sunday at 3:00 or whatever, and Sunday at 3:00 comes around, and you're like, man, I just don't feel like it.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier to put that off and say, oh, I can do it later. It's like, whatever, I'll do it later.
Right.
But when you have a commitment with someone else, you're like, oh, I don't feel like doing it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And and then you get into it and you're like, oh, So how do you think people can learn how to follow through with commitments to themselves in a better way?
Oh, the first thing obviously is building awareness around it, building awareness around our actions. That was one of the most valuable takeaways for me from therapy. Is we were encouraged to build a network of other people who were working through the same things, and we were taught to become rigorously accountable for all of our decisions, not just ones related to what we were working on. And so we got to the point, Adam, where we were saying, well, okay, I'm going to commit to be home by 5 today, or I'm going to commit to not eat any sugar today, or it doesn't matter what it is, right? I'm going to commit to not watch Netflix for the next month. But then we would find an accountability partner. You find somebody to help you stay accountable to that. Because again, just talked about, for whatever reason, we as humans are pretty quick to just, oh, no one else knows, it's just me, it's fine, I'll just do it anyway. But if we've told somebody, and ideally if we said we're going to follow up with them every week, every month, whatever, then we have that extra bit of accountability there. So that to me was huge, and remains a very valuable part of keeping my own commitments there. If there's something that I know I need to do or that I want to do, I will try to set myself up for success. So for me, it's my brothers or my wife.
Okay.
And I'll say, you know what, podcast. In fact, I had to do this with my podcast because I spent 6 months saying I was going to do a podcast. Never happened. And finally hit a point where I said, I'm not keeping my commitments here, but I know I need to do this. So I committed to a couple people. I said, I'm going to have my first episode published by next Friday. Like, come hell or high water.
There we go.
And now I had 2 other people that I knew were going to hold me accountable to it. And, if I didn't do it, they weren't going to shame me, and they weren't going to burn my house down, but there's just
Right.
that extra little bit of, like, I committed,
Yeah.
not just to myself now, but other people. So that to me is a great way, almost training wheels, if you will, but then something, if you can build those relationships that will help you throughout your life.
I think that's a great example. I really do. I'll give you an example of something that happened with me this year, talking about writing and podcasts and stuff like that. Over the summer, a couple of writer friends of mine here locally, we decided we wanted to do a 90-day writing challenge. And I started writing, and I don't know, I had 3 months to do this little writing challenge, and I failed. I didn't do it. And a lot of it was, just dealing with different things and, not making it my priority because I was dealing with some personal issues and things like that. And, so I had to accept that failure, and I had to look at like, well, okay, well, what can I learn from this failure? And so in November, they did the National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo. And it's a challenge where you have to write 50,000 words or more for a novel. And I'd never done it before. And so I was like, you know what? I want to finish this follow-up to this fiction book that I've written. And so I signed up for NaNoWriMo, and I did it, and I completed it. I did over 50,000 words in the month, and, and it felt really good. And it's one of those things where, you go through and you do all these things, you set these goals and you metric your goals, you measure them, and, you check your progress and those kind of things. And sometimes you're still going to fail, but, with that, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to take this failure and take the stuff that I learned from, trying to do it over 90 days, and I'm going to have to compress that into a 30-day window. What work do I have to do to get this done? And I think that, like when you're talking about your podcast and having that accountability. So like what I did for accountability with the NaNoWriMo was I put it all over my social media, made it public. And I was like, okay, every day I put the little counter out there, every single day I put the counter out there because I wanted, not so much that anybody would say, oh, you're not where you should be, you're, whatever. I wanted to do it because of that mental factor of like, okay, well, I can't let other people down, my one reader or whatever that I have out there. I can't let that person down, and it was kind of funny because towards the end of the month, I had a couple of people saying, oh yeah, it's getting closer, and and they kind of got charged up like seeing it, so I just think it's kind of neat when you have that goal and you set that goal and you say, you know what, there has to be some kind of compelling reason to pull you forward, like with the podcast, you're like, okay, well, this is a great medium for me to be able to continue helping other people with the stuff that I've learned, and I think that's
right.
I think that's a great incentive. You're like, oh, you know what? You've already had a lot of feedback from people writing in about your shows. I mean, we're talking today because I saw that you were doing a podcast, and I was like, oh, you know what? I would love to talk with you about, your new podcast. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
well, and I love, to bring it full circle here for a minute, Adam, what you were saying about NaNoWriMo, the first time you did it, or not that, but the first time you tried to write something and you didn't do it, you had a choice there. You could have said, oh man, see, I just, all these other writers, so jealous of them. I wish I had their life. Isn't that so cool? I just can't write a book. Or, you could have gone any other direction of victim mindset and again, give away your happiness, your control of your happiness. But instead you said, Okay, I didn't keep my promise. You took responsibility, and then you went at it again. So now, Rimo, then you realized it mattered enough to you to really set up that accountability. So you found a way to make it work. You found a way to get enough accountability in there to where you hit your goal. I think that's a perfect example of taking that responsibility for your own happiness, for your own success. It doesn't mean, like you said, it always goes, well, quote unquote, perfectly. All we're focused on is exactly what you said, which is, if this matters to you, figure it out.
Yeah.
Find a way.
Yeah.
Use the internet. Talk to a friend. I mean, there you can always find the next step.
Do you ever find, Michael, and I don't, I don't, I'm just going to preface it like this. Do you ever find sometimes people will say, I don't have this resource or I don't have that resource. I can't do it because I don't have this. One of the things that I like to say to people when I hear that is, I understand where you're coming from. You're not going to have all the resources when you first start, but if you're resourceful, you will find a way.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal? Because I'm sure you get inundated with people saying, "Oh, I don't," like when you made the question, you made the example earlier about the being married. Well, we've been married for 20 years or something like that, and they don't do this and they don't do that. How do you deal with that with folks? Trying to get them off of that mentality of like I don't have, or like a scarcity mentality, basically.
Yeah, well, when I work with them on my one-on-one coaching, or sometimes in an email response to just a question, I really do, at risk of sounding overly simplistic, I help them recognize what their next steps are. What can they control? Okay. And it's oftentimes the same, different situations, but most situations come back to the same thing. Somebody will come to me and they'll say, well, can you help me fix my spouse? Can you help me fix my boss? Can you help me fix my child? And I can give them tools to help, but pretty quickly, in one or two calls, they go, oh, okay, well, there's some things I can change first.
Okay.
And usually that's where it all starts. And so I really like what you're saying there, Adam, on the, on the technical side, if you will, a podcast. Well, I can't start a podcast because I don't have a microphone. I don't have a computer. I don't have whatever. Well, maybe do you have a smartphone? Okay, great. Well, you can start there. There are apps. There's so many different ways you can take it there. And on the relationships, it's no different. If somebody comes to me and they just are complaining the whole time about their partner, I can't listen to that for very long. I can listen and validate, but if they just want to keep complaining, they're not going anywhere. So my first question is, what do you want? Do you want this relationship to work? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's look at some next steps you can take to try to give it a good chance. You just want a good relationship? Yes. Well, this is not a good relationship. You've told me that. So are you willing to take the first step, which is ending this relationship, so that you can open yourself up for the next? Every situation is different, but there's always something you can do yourself to take it one step further.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think going back to that accountability, and just being a self-aware, being aware of like, okay, well, when you were talking about earlier about, blaming, like say for instance, the kids don't do this, blaming the kids. It's like, well, you had some part in that,
Right.
Did they model that behavior after something that you did, or did they learn it somewhere else? How was that interaction with them, when you found out, little Bobby was failing math? Did you do something to help? Or did you just say, oh, you should do this or you should do this? Did you blame the kid? So I think it comes back to that accountability. Like, it's not easy, when you fail. And I think people, when they're in that situation, they feel like they're failing. Nobody wants to admit they're failing. Nobody wants to admit that they mess up and make mistakes. Nobody likes that feeling because it's not a good feeling. We want to win, right? But when you're talking about going back to that, well, I can't listen to that very long. I'm the same way. I'm like, okay, kind of goes back to that. Why, are you complaining just to complain, or, are you trying to, communicate that you have an issue that you don't know how to resolve yet?
Exactly.
So
exactly, because I sympathize and empathize, with every situation people bring to me.
Right.
I like to think that I'm a pretty sincere person and that I'm pretty empathic, and I genuinely do care about the people that I work with, and that's why I do the work that I do. And so, even like you said with parenting, talking about their kids, I'm careful to not say, well, that's your fault. Your kids screw it up, and it's your fault, because that's not. It's like, we're all human.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's
So
like it's not necessarily it's your fault, but it's more like you had something to do with it. It's like you're the parent. You have a responsibility to the kid.
Yeah, like every parent has something to do with how their child's acting, and that's not good or bad. It just is. And so that's what's freeing about the work that I do and the principles that I teach, is that it's not shaming. It's the opposite. It's saying, hey, we're all human.
Yeah.
Hey, we all deal with something like this. That's fine. The good news is you're likely not alone. You're very likely not the only person who's dealing with this situation. And surprise, if you can make some changes to the messaging you're saying in your head, if you can change the way you're approaching this with your children or with your spouse or with your colleagues, then a lot of this gets easier. And that's what's so freeing about it, is that I'm not just saying, hey, you just need to be happy and it's your job to be happy. Good luck. I'm saying, no, the truth is you are responsible for your happiness, and let's look at why. And let's look at some tools to help you regain that happiness if you feel like you lost it. Let's look at tools to teach your children how to take ownership for their own happiness and to be responsible and connecting and loving human beings.
I love that. I want to I know we've got to wrap it up here, but I just want to share this one story with you. I had a cousin of mine who had a really bad situation, and she was, we were talking, and she was the, like the all-star kid growing up, right? And then when she got into college, she just had some different difficulties, and we were talking, and I told her, I said, she felt like she was a failure, and I was talking with her, and I said, you know what? I said, what it's like to win. The people that grew up and, they've always had everything, they did, they were like I just said the all-star kids or whatever. When they get to adulthood and they face their first failures, because adulthood, you're going to have a series of different difficulties, right? It's harder for them, I think, to have failure and be able to move forward because they're used to winning, But what I told her, I said, you know what it's like to be a winner. The steps that it takes, the work that goes into, this process. You have to do the work. And I told her, I was like, whatever decisions you've made now, you can make better decisions, because once you know what it's like to win, you can duplicate and replicate that success. Those work habits, those, the work ethic, you can't teach somebody to have a good work ethic. They just have to want to do it. You can show them good habits, but, they're not going to have a good work ethic, just because you say, oh, you should have a good work ethic. Just like you're saying with happiness, somebody's not going to be happy just because you say, well, you should do this to be happy. They have to own it, So
yeah,
I just love it. Michael, we have to wrap it up here. I'm so glad that you've been on the show today. One last time, where can people check out your new podcast and your other stuff that you've got going on?
Yeah, so my website, michaelsorensen.com, has all my latest articles, podcast episodes, and so forth, information on my book. And again, you can find my podcast. It's titled I Hear You, the I Hear You podcast, and that's on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever else you get your podcast.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Michael, so much for being on the show today. And I look forward, I'll have to have you back on probably another 5 or 6 months. We'll get back on and we'll talk more about like the podcasting world and stuff like that. It'd be cool.
Yeah.
So
that sounds great. Thanks again for the opportunity, Adam. It was great chatting with you.
All right. We'll talk to you later. Thanks.